Hello and welcome back to the free online woodworking school where we aim to take your woodworking skills to the next level. In today's video, we are going to get the dovetails that we cut in the previous episode nested into the side of the cabinet. Let's get going. So in the previous series that we did for the free online woodworking school, we broke this stage down into two different steps. The first one was transferring the tails onto the pins, and then the second video was cutting those pins out. In this video, we're going to combine both of those steps and mash it into one, but keep it systematic at the same time. And what I mean by that is we're going to do all of the marking out before cutting anything. That way we can double check anything, check that we're not about to nest a dovetail to the outside of the cabinet rather than in, and check that the offset of the back dovetail is the same all the way round. Because remember in the previous episode, I said that the dovetail at the front is flush with the front of the cabinet. The dovetail at the back is offset by 4mm when we use this little spacer that I bodged together here. So the first order of operations is going to be marking the depth of the tails into the sides of the carcass. We've already marked in how far they're going to go horizontally, but we haven't established the vertical depth just yet. Now, when cutting dovetails in other series and in tutorials, I often set the dovetail so that it sits in a little bit below being flush with the top surface, meaning that there's end grain sitting proud. This works quite well for boxes where you're going to be planing the joint flush anyway. However, for this cabinet, if you set it so the tail is too deep, you've got quite a lot of end grain that you need to trim down and also keep square. And you've also got to keep it the same height as the other panel in the cabinet. Like flushing down end grain in this instance is not really something you want to be doing. So to mark the exact depth of these tails and ensure that when it goes together, it is perfectly flush, we're going to put the tails onto a flat surface. And we're simply going to rest the marking gauge on the tail while dropping the pin so that it sits on the surface below. Once we're happy with that, lock it down. And you can see now that the marking gauge is set to the exact thickness of that pin, but keep in mind this only works on marking gauges where the cutter is the last point on the marking gauge. If, for example, you've got a screw holding that cutter in place that's sticking out beyond the cutting point of the marking gauge, then this technique is not going to work because the screw is going to hit the surface before the cutter does. We are then going to scratch that on the inside of the cabinet below each of these joints. So remember in the last episode we marked the boundaries for those joints. Make sure that you keep this marking gauge line within those lines. In fact, don't even go up to the edge of it because you run the risk of overshooting it and making it visible beyond the edge of the dovetail, which you don't really want. Also keep in mind that you only need to mark this on the inside face of the cabinet. You do not need to mark this depth on the outside of the cabinet as indicated by the face side, because the lapped dovetail will not be showing on that face and we don't need a baseline there. So to mark these out, I'm going to clamp this in the vise and then we're going to get a supporting surface behind it. I'm just going to use the other side of the cabinet. Remember that we want the face side out on here because you want the tails nesting into the cabinet. It's very easy to accidentally dovetail on the outside, so pay attention to that face side mark. So I can just see on here that the face side mark is sweeping away, meaning that this is the front edge of the cabinet and this is the back, meaning that this is the dovetail that needs to be flush with the front. And so I'm actually going to use the offset block but just use the flat face on it for now to get that tail perfectly flush with the front surface. There you go, I've literally just held it flat across there and very lightly to start with. Remember, gradually increase the pressure as you go. We're going to scribe around this tail. And obviously in doing this, I have double checked that the number I'm scribing around matches the number on the pin socket. So then with this one at the back, that's number 3, we're going to use our offset thing. So I'll pop it on there. The 4mm offset is now hooked into the carcass. Put the tail up against it and then slide that up until we see the shoulder lines match up and the end of the tail matches the marking gauge line. And by the way, if you don't have a spacer just yet, I'd advise setting a marking gauge to 4mm and scribing a line on the back of the carcass, and then you can just simply line up the tail with that line that you've scribed in. But I think that using a spacer is much more accurate and predictable. Okay, so the dovetails are all transferred and the next job is to start attaching those lines that we've scribed along the end grain down to the baseline that I scratched into the face of the material at the start of this video. But before doing that, I am just going to put them together and double check that I haven't done any stupids. So I've put them together again with the face sides out on both components and the face edges forward, so exactly as it would be if the cabinet was assembled. And I'm just going to check that the offset ones are indeed at the back and the ones that are flush are indeed at the front. I'm also just going to double check my numbering system again, check that that hasn't gone wrong in any areas. So 7 and 8, that side is all fine. Let's flip them over. So yep, the offset ones are here. That's the front of the cabinet, that's all good. And then we'll have 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. Smashing. So to join these up, again, I'm just going to use a knife and a square. Just be very careful not to let the knife start tracking the grain here. And of course, on each of these, I'm going to mark the waste so that I don't cut out the wrong part of the socket, which I'd hope would be quite difficult to do, but we won't tempt fate. So if cutting lap dovetails is new to you, cutting these sockets out is a bit of a weird one because you can't cut all the way through like you would with a through dovetail because we're only going in halfway. So we're going to have to angle our saw up at, with this, because the baseline's deeper than it is going in, we're actually going to be angling the saw sort of beyond 45 degrees. It's really weird, and it's actually quite difficult to cut to the line when doing this. So I usually cut about 0.5 millimeter to 1 millimeter away and then clean it up with a chisel. The other thing that I like doing on lap dovetails, which is seen as barbaric by a lot of people, but it gets the job done, is I actually drill out a lot of the waste, because as you see when you're doing this, it's really difficult to clean out that bottom corner because there's this steep incline of waste in there that you just have to chip out by going in horizontally, vertical, horizontal, vertical, and it takes ages. Drilling it out usually gets it done a little bit quicker. So we'll do this one first. So we're gonna just start by taking out that corner. You might be able to see I am probably about 1 millimeter away from that line. If we zoom out a second, this is what I'm having to do to achieve this cut. It's a bit of a joke really. So when you're doing this, make sure that you haven't clamped the piece close to the vise below, because if you're using a quick release vise, for example, it's really easy to smack the teeth on that cast iron surface, which wouldn't be good. So I'm going to stop just shy of that back line. Start the other one. Okay, so it's about time to drill out the waste. So I've gone for a 6 millimeter bit with a stop collar attached to it to prevent me from drilling all the way through the cabinet. These are really useful. They come in a range of sizes to suit different diameter bits, and I use them all the time. You can see on this one that I'm using a brad point drill bit to prevent any wobble as we first enter the piece and stop us from missing the socket altogether. So that brad point will be really useful. Obviously I've set it so the point is going to be cutting slightly into the back of the socket, but this won't be seen at all after assembly. And it allows the actual drilling portion of this drill bit to clear out the majority of the waste, minus about 0.5 millimeter, which I can chisel back to later. And I've chosen to drill into the face of the wood as opposed to the end grain, because drilling into the face will create short grain above the drill bit, because the grain is traveling down like this. If we drill into the face of it like that, the area above it will easily break off. Whereas if you drill with the grain, yes, you're going to clear out some circles, but the grain that's left behind is still going to be attached at the baseline. Now, if you really want to, you could obviously swap between the two, but going in from the face usually does it for me. So the piece is firmly clamped down, and keep in mind that this collar that I've attached to the drill is for indication only. You don't want to start forcing the drill into the wood because it may cause it to slip up the drill bit. It's only a grub screw holding it in place, so don't use too much force of this. Let the drill do the work for you. Every now and then I will just double check that collar to make sure it hasn't slipped. You could of course do this on a drill press with a depth stop as well if you have one. And you can see, look, this is why we're drilling into the face. You can already see the grain is starting to chip away because of the short grain. I could probably just, yeah, that bit's already gone. But by doing those saw cuts to begin with, it's meant that all of these parts that have chipped off have not gone beyond those saw lines that we cut either side. So then when cutting back to these lines, I aim to get it within about 1/2 millimetre of the entire line to start with before committing to the final chop. And so to hog out the majority of this waste, I find it easier to use a smaller chisel. This is a 1/4 inch 6mm chisel, which will start us off. And then I reckon, yeah, I'll be able to get this wider one in for the final cut to ensure that back line is nice and straight. If you try and chisel directly to that line with a smaller chisel, you're highly likely to get steps along it. But a smaller chisel is very good at just clearing waste. And look at that, because of the short grain, it's chipping away very, very easily. You need to come in from the front every now and then to remove what you've chipped away. Careful not to push too hard when doing this though, because you don't want to smash out that back wall. All I'm doing for the moment is just chipping out that short grain. We'll lay the board flat on the bench on this face afterwards and clean out back to the shoulder line. We'll just work into this top line now. Yeah, I'm pretty happy with that. So with a nice wide chisel, freshly sharpened edge, very small taps with this. You see I didn't go directly onto the line with this one. I'm doing it in 2 separate cuts to ensure the chisel doesn't get pushed beyond the line. And when I'm doing this, you'll see that I'm also looking along the back of the chisel to ensure that it's cutting down square. If I'm standing here, I cannot see that angle. So watch it from here. Very small and controlled taps. Got some little bits to sort out in the corners. So that's not going anywhere at the moment. I'm not going to force it. I'm going to start working my way back to these side walls now. Again, I'm looking along the back of the chisel to ensure it's going down square. And after chiseling back to the line on the top, that's left us with a bunch of fibres that are still attached at the bottom, minus the few that are chipping away. And I find that the easiest way to get rid of them, and the safest method, is to clamp it flat on the bench so that you get effective power transfer with the chisel, and find a chisel that matches the width of the baseline as close as possible. And carefully tap in like that, and listen for that sound change. That's when you've hit the back of the socket. There. So I'm now within 1/2 millimetre of the line. The chisel will go into it now. Make sure it's nice and locked in there, and then chisel down at 90. And what you should find now is that many of these fibres should just chip away. So I'm using one of my knives to do this. I have got eye protection on just in case the blade happens to break due to uneven and excessive force. That's a large majority of those shavings chipped away. And now with most of that rubbish removed, we can see exactly what we're working with. Still got some stuff in the back corner. And because I've only got to chip away small remnants in the bottom of that socket now, I'm going to clamp it upright in the vise with a nice big supporting block behind it. This will support the back wall as I put pressure on it from the front. And this allows me to easily see all the stuff I need to chip away still. All right, let's see how this fits. That's a start. So very light taps with this. So what we have here is a very, very common problem with lapped dovetails. You can probably see the very small gap at the top of the tail, and there's also an even gap at the top of either of the shoulders. And this is almost always caused by the back wall on the socket not being vertical, i.e. it's sloping like that. So what happens is as the tail goes in, it hits the back wall and it starts pushing it away from the inside of the carcass. It's very easy to clean up, but it is the most common problem I see with lapped dovetails, and it is easily fixable. And looking in this socket, most of it looks good, but there is something here going on that I reckon might be bumped out slightly. And like seriously, it can be the most stupid, minute thing that throws the entire tail out. I'll probably find that by removing that section, it will sort the entire thing out. But I'm going to take an even skim of the entire back wall. And the way you do this is not by resting the chisel on the top of the socket, because that's going to cut it too deep, but rest it on the inside wall, but a couple of millimeters down. And then you're going to need to slightly angle it in order to make it cut. And then just push very carefully. There we go. Let's see how that now looks. Definitely starts off a lot easier. much better. Look at that. And there you go, that's the difference by simply straightening out that back wall. Mental. Also, after you've assembled it, just double check that it is square on the inside edge as well, which that is, because quite often it can look like it's closed up at the top, but it's because it's angled up like this, and it gives the illusion that there's no gaps in the joint, but as soon as you straighten it out to be 90 degrees, you'll see those gaps on the end appear just as you did earlier. Again, still caused by the back wall not being straight, so just always double check that it is going in square. Right, there we go, carcass complete. Didn't take too long as you're systematic with it, i.e. you do all the cutting at once, do all the chiseling at once, and do all the refining at once. It shouldn't really take you much longer than 2 or 3 hours to cut out all of the sockets. As always, just make sure you're working with sharp tools and you think about what you're doing every step of the way. Think about the grain direction, think about how the grain might split, and always make sure that you're viewing the chisel from an angle that's going to be beneficial to what you're doing. Most of the time, that's sighting the back and checking that you're chiseling at 90 degrees. So that is it for this lesson. If you felt that this kind of skimmed over the topic of lap dovetailing a bit too quickly for you, then be sure to have a look at the supporting resources listed below. There'll be all sorts down there to help you with this stage and will help you get a really, really good result. So you're now ready to move on to the next lesson, which you can do so by clicking the link below. And if you haven't already, please subscribe by pressing the big round button to the left-hand side of the video. I'll see you in the next one.